Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is CJ the Populist New Yorker, and today we're going to be doing our August 2021 2022 gubernatorial election midterms. So we're going to be taking a look at the various governor's races around the country that are going to be taking place in 2022. I've already marked off the races that I deem to be safe in either camp, whether it's Republican or Democrat. In some of the New England states, there's a little room for debate because I don't think Phil Scott nor Charlie Baker have said they're going to run again. And of course, there is the mystery of what Kristi is actually going to be doing in 2022, whether he's running for Senate or not. So it's still up for debate. However, just for the sake of things right now, as of August 2021, we're going to leave the state of New Hampshire as safe Republican. I expect that to be moved down if Kristi is not the nominee for the Republicans going into it. So let's get started. Again, some of these blank states are not necessarily states that are really in contention. It's just more that I like to mark it based on the margin that the victor will win by. So Colorado, for instance, is almost certainly going to be a Democratic hold. But I don't have it listed as safe because I don't think the margin is going to be over 12 points. It'll probably be something around 10 or 11. But let's get right into it. Let's move west to east as we typically do. We'll start off with the West Coast in the state of Oregon. Now, Oregon is a Democratic state, no doubt. But on the state level, Oregon tends to be a lot more purple. Not really so competitive, but Democrats tend to do a lot worse in statewide races than they do federally. We could just look at the 2020 election results and compare them to 2018. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state of Oregon by 15.1%. This is actually a pretty large margin for a Democrat, even in the state of Oregon. I believe even McCain got 41% here in the state. Trump only got 40% and Joe Biden got 56%. We could take a look at the Senate race as well. Incumbent Senator Jeff Merkley winning by a little bit more than Joe Biden won. He won by around over 16 points. And you could compare these results, of course, with the gubernatorial results last time around. Kate Brown only barely eking out a majority of the vote, 50.1% to a Republican challenger. And this happens in a lot of statewide races, and it is a curious phenomenon that occurs not only in Oregon, but also in Washington. So that's one of the reasons why I don't have this governor's race as safe. One of the candidates who I think ran in 2016 is running again, one of the Republicans. And I certainly think this is a race that, as of right now, could probably be in a likely margin, but for the sake of things, we're just going to put this as likely Democratic. Again, we have no polling or information on this specific race yet, so I don't really know whether to gauge it as safe or not, but for now we're going to put this as likely Republican. California is not so much not safe, it's more so that I just wanted to talk about the state real quick. I'd done a video, in fact my last video a few days ago, on the California recall. If you want to see that video, I'll put it down in the description below. But California is pretty interesting going into 2022. Because a lot of the people running in the recall are also running in 2022. Kevin Faulconer, who is the former Republican mayor of San Diego, he's running again. He's also running in the recall as well. Same with Kevin Paffrath, who is the leading Democratic declared. Of course, Gavin Newsom would be if he actually did run for his seat in 2022. Now, obviously, I think if Gavin Newsom loses his recall, he might not run in 2022, considering he'd probably even lose a primary at that point. But I think if he wins the recall, he's certainly going to take another shot at it, and he'd be a lot more vulnerable in 2022, I think, than at any other time in his political history, except right now. Of course, in 2018, Gavin Newsom won by an overwhelming margin, a 61-38 margin. This is a big margin even for California on the state level. A lot of time Democrats, Republicans rather, usually break 40% in statewide races. But in 2018, Gavin Newsom demolished John Cox's opponent, who is actually also running in the recall, but polling at like 4% or something. So I don't think this race is going to be likely or even lean. I think it's going to be safe Democrat. But the question is, which Democrat will it be? We don't really know. Of course, it's more likely than not going to be Gavin Newsom. But again, perhaps it's Pathrath or somebody else. Perhaps even if Gavin Newsom does win his recall, he calls it quits and doesn't run in 2022. So we'll really see how things unfold there. Alaska is not necessarily similar to California. It's more of something I wanted to talk about. Alaska is a very weird state on the state level. In 2018, the governorship flipped Republican from independent. But the Republican only won by around 6 points, and Republicans tend not to win by big margins statewide, as there's a lot of independents splitting the votes. Republicans still usually prevail, and the reason I wanted to talk about it mainly is because the margin could be a little iffy depending on how big the third-party presence is, and Bill Walker, who was the governor in 2014, who won the governorship in 2014, I should say, is running again as an independent. As for actual Democrats, it's a lot harder because Democrats haven't won in Alaska in a very long time. I think since 2008, since the Senate race in 2008. But for now, we're going to put this as safe Republican. But it's just something I wanted to talk about because the margin could be a little wacky once we actually get to 2022. Nevada is... I would say as of now, lean Democratic. Again, if we take a look at the Nevada gubernatorial race, Steve Sisolak is running for a second term. You have a lot of Republicans lined up to challenge him. It seems like Dean Heller is probably going to be the most formidable challenge to Sisolak, or for the other Republicans, I should say. But there's a whole lot of Republicans running. You have John Lee, who was formerly a Democrat, now a Republican running for governor. So you have a lot of people running in this race. But I certainly think Sisolak has a big advantage because I've seen his approval numbers, and they're a lot higher than Catherine Cortez Masto's. So we very well could see a situation where Sisolak holds on, but Catherine Cortez Masto loses somehow. And that's because governors tend to have more name recognition than senators. Your governor does a lot more and affects your daily life a lot more than your senator does. So I think that's going to be lean Democratic for right now. Arizona is going to be a close one either way, I think. It currently has a Republican governor in Doug Ducey. And there's a lot of Republicans running in the primary to be governor. Of course, you have Kimberly Yee, the current Arizona state treasurer, news anchor. You've got businessmen. Mark Bronovich, who decided not to run, is actually running for U.S. Senate. A lot of big names in Arizona. Of course, if Kelly Ward wins the nomination, that would probably be a disaster for the Republicans. She's never done well statewide. She usually was the one to primary John McCain, I believe in 2016, and she ran again in the primary in 2018, both times lost. Definitely represents more of the further right wing of the Republican Party. As for the Democrats, Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State, who I've heard is actually quite a weak candidate, has a lot of baggage, so I don't really know how well she'd perform for the governorship, but a lot of the polls so far, the only poll, which is a Democratic poll, actually favors the Republicans, and this is something I've said for the past few predictions now. I actually think the Republicans will have a slight edge in Arizona in the governor's race. Now, this is going to be different than the Senate race, and we know Arizona is a state to split tickets. We can go back to the 2018 Arizona gubernatorial race. Doug Ducey winning by over 14 points in a blue wave year, and that same election, those same voters elected Kyrsten Sinema to the Senate. So I really think this is very likely going to be a state where it's very possible we could see a split ticket. Colorado, New Mexico, we're not going to really talk a whole lot about. I'd say both of them are probably likely at this point. The only poll we have out of New Mexico actually has a Republican beating Michelle Lujan Grisham, the incumbent Democrat. But it's a signal poll, it's an R poll, and it's very early in the cycle. I don't really take it with any real weight. I think Michelle Lujan Grisham will have no problem running for re-election. Incumbent Democrats do very well in New Mexico. It's non-incumbents who do a bit worse. We could just take a look at the Senate race in New Mexico between Ben Ray Lujan, who's a current senator now, and Mike Ronchetti. Ben Ray Lujan only won by a little bit over 5 points, about 6 points or so. over his Republican challenger. This is a small margin for a state like New Mexico, but as in 2012, and as I actually said in my prediction video where I analyzed this race, New Mexico tends to be a lot more friendly to Republicans in open years when there's no incumbent. But when there's an incumbent, they tend to be much more favorable toward Democrats. And that's why I think this race is not really going to be competitive this time around. Kansas is going to be a race to watch on election night next year because there is a Democratic governor in a very red state, one of the reddest states in the country. If you go back historically speaking, Kansas hasn't elected a Republican senator since the 1930s. But again, federal races are different than state races, but I think that's worthy to note as this state is very, very Republican. We don't have any actual general election polling in this race, so it's very hard to determine. But I do think, as of right now, you know, what's her name? Laura Kelly. I don't know why I was going to say Kelly Ward. But I think, as of right now, she's probably going to lose her governorship by a lean margin. I just think the political weight is stacked against her. I think her approval rating is in the positive, but when you're in a state as red as Kansas, you need to be a very, very popular governor, and you have to have the stars aligned. Kind of like with John Bel Edwards. John Bel Edwards in 2019 had a pretty awful opponent in Eddie Risponi. He had a lot of baggage. Didn't seem like a very smart guy. And John Bel Edwards ended up narrowly eking out a victory there. Had it been, I think his name was Abraham or something, the other Republican probably would have beat John Bel Edwards, actually. And John Bel Edwards was a popular governor. So we could see something. We've seen this time and time again in other states as well. But in Kansas, I wouldn't be shocked if Laura Kelly is in the positive on election night and still loses. Because at the end of the day, a lot of voters just vote for their party. Even if they like Laura Kelly, they think she's doing a good job, they're still going to vote for the Republican because that's where their beliefs align. In 2018, the stars really did align for Laura Kelly. Well, this is the Senate one, but she really had everything going for her. She had a very unpopular Republican outgoing, and she was up against a very unpopular Republican in the state of Kansas in Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach was seen as too far right, even for the state of Kansas, on a number of issues, and it didn't really work out for him. The state of Kansas elected Trump by a pretty large margin, I think high teens, but they didn't like a Trump acolyte like Chris Kobach for a number of reasons, and he ultimately lost by 5 points. So she really had everything going for her the first time. Will she have that same luck again in 2022? I highly doubt it, objectively speaking. Minnesota, I think, is definitely going to be likely Democrat. Tim Walz is going to have no problem running for re-election. And I always find it interesting, the more I look at it, the Republicans' fascination with flipping a state like Minnesota. Minnesota, in my opinion, has no promise of flipping anytime soon to the GOP. And the main reason for that is the Minneapolis suburbs. They've been getting a lot larger and a lot bluer. Even as the rest of the state trends more Republican, the urban center is just simply too large and too Democratic to outvote. We saw that in 2020, in the 2020 presidential election. Even with rural areas trending more Republican, especially here in the Southwest, and you did have some trend more Democrat, the urban areas trended massively more Democrat, and that's why you saw a 52-45 margin, which is a margin we haven't seen out of the state since the Obama years. But if we just look at Tim Walz, of course, Tim Walz won by 11 points. Even in a reddish year, again, we can go back to 2014, etc. Democrats have no problem winning in the state of Minnesota, regardless. So I think this is going to be a likely blue hold for the Democrats. Wisconsin is another story, because Wisconsin, you have a governor in Tony Evers who only won by 1.1%, a very tiny margin, just eked out a victory here in the state of Wisconsin. I'm not sure if we have any polling on this race, but we'll check now, because I'm not 100% sure if we have any general election polling. We do. We have a polling from a Democratic pollster, and we have polling from Republicans. Now, what I will note right away is that even in the Democratic poll, Tony Evers is only leading by 1 point. That should be concerning if you're a Democrat running in the state of Wisconsin. Again, a lot of times, especially presidentially speaking, Democrats are supposed to be leading by 6 to 8 points in the polls, And that usually means they're only going to win by 1 or 2. Wisconsin polls are very unreliable. We saw that in both general elections. The polls this time in Wisconsin, I think, had Biden up by 4 or 5, or I think even higher in some cases. It could have been 8 again. And he only really ended up winning by about 0.6%. But when we look at Tony Evers himself, I think he's very vulnerable, personally. And I think the reason why is I think the Republican legislature, in a lot of ways, prevents him from doing things he otherwise could have. The Republican legislature has a lot more power in Wisconsin than other states over what the governor can do. So they've been able to block a lot of things Tony Evers has actually wanted to do that probably would have made him more popular with Wisconsin voters. And I think that's actually going to hurt him in 2022. So I actually would put Wisconsin as a tilt flip right now. And again, this is subject to change, of course, and ultimately is my opinion over a year out from the election. But I see it entirely possible that Tony Evers would be defeated by a Republican because of something like this, because of Republican obstruction in the legislature, blocking major priorities that he could tout as achievements in 2022. And also, of course, the red wave factor as well, if there is a red wave. But I definitely think there's going to be a red advantage nonetheless. Michigan, I think the Democrats certainly has the edge. Joe Biden won the state of Michigan by nearly 3 points in 2020. Gretchen Whitmer won the state by a little under 10 points back in 2018. And Michigan is certainly a lot bluer statewide than a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. Michigan doesn't have any Republican senators. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania at the moment do. In fact, Michigan hasn't had a Republican senator since, I believe, 2000 or something like that. So basically for the entire century. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's true. But ultimately, I think Whitmer is going to be definitely heavily targeted by Republicans. And certainly, it wouldn't be wrong to do that. Again, we have polls that are conflicting. One poll has James Craig up by a lot. This is a Republican poll. The Democratic poll has Whitmer up by around 6. Yeah, we can look at other polling with Whitmer and other Republicans. And it's really all over the place. In some, she's winning. In some, there's a couple she's losing. But that's with the generic opponents. I really think, as of right now, I think Michigan is probably lean Democratic. It very well could change into a higher or lower category. But I think, as of right now, Whitmer would probably win by around 3 to 4 points if the 2022 gubernatorial election was held right now. Ohio is a really interesting case because we have a Republican governor who might not even survive a primary. Mike DeWine took a very different approach from other Republican governors back when during COVID-19 and all that stuff last year. He took a very different approach to what most Republicans were doing. He was very in favor of mask mandates, locking down the state, etc. And that doesn't bode too well for Republicans in general in the state. Republican primary voters who are going to probably be energized to vote Mike DeWine out. There's a lot of people running against him. Jim Renacci is one of the largest names. He was the, I believe he was the nominee in 2018. Let's take a look. For the Senate. I think he was the 2018 Republican Senate nominee. He was. But Ohio has changed since then. And he was against a popular incumbent senator. It's very possible that Jim Renacci wins this primary. And again, as this gets closer, I'll probably make a specific video on it, on the governor's race. But either way, depending on the Republican, I would say this is either a likely or safe state. I would put it as safe right now, considering, let's just assume Mike DeWine does win his primary. I think he would easily win by a safe margin. He's still a relatively popular governor. And I think he's more popular among Democrats and independents than Republicans, funny enough. Kind of like a Larry Hogan situation or a Charlie Baker situation. So I think he would probably win in a landslide if he actually does make it to the general. Again, Trump won the state of Ohio back... Oh, I don't know why that's not working. There we go. Back in 2020 by around 8 points, 8.1%. While other swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin all went blue. I think it's safe to say that Ohio is a red state now. I would categorize it as a red state, similar to Iowa. I'm not saying it's a safe red state, but it's certainly a lean red state. I certainly think as of now, Republicans have a certain advantage going into the state. And I think that also translates in on the gubernatorial level. The state of Maine, we actually have a former governor running for the state of Maine in Paul LePage. In 2018, I keep confusing the two of these. In 2018, Janet Mills, the current governor, won by 50.9% to her Republican opponent, 43.2%. This is actually when Maine, I think, had instituted ranked choice voting, but it didn't go to ranked choice because Janet Mills got over 50%. But had she gotten under, she probably would have won by an even larger margin of like 10 points or so. But you know, she's a fairly average governor. I don't really hear a whole lot about her, positive or negative. She just kind of exists, I assume. In the polling, of course, she's winning by a considerable amount. Now, I will note that in 2020, the polls did favor Sarah Gideon heavily. In fact, I think they favored her to the point where she was leading in every poll in the fall of 2020. And ultimately, Susan Collins won. Now, I think that's very likely a one-off. Susan Collins was an incumbent senator. She was unpopular, but she was able to get the voters, all the Republicans and like 20% of the Democrats, to vote for her. I don't know about this in this case. I think for right now, Maine is probably going to be in the... I'm going to probably move it to lean. I think that's more realistic. I think the race has the potential to be fairly close, but it still might be a 5-point margin for Janet Mills or something like that, all things considered. Maine is definitely not as blue as it has been in the past in off-year races like 2014, 2010. Maine is a lot redder now than it was then. I mean, we can look at the 2020 election results. Trump got 44% of the vote in the state of Maine. Prior to 2016, no Republican had gotten that high of an amount in Maine, I believe, since '88. I could be wrong. The younger Bush might have gotten maybe 44%. But you know, Maine is now within single digits, presidentially speaking. And this was a state where Trump was not even popular. So I think the state of Maine slowly is shifting towards Republicans. It's going to be a slow shift because it is New England. But I think you very well could see a more competitive Maine by the end of the decade. But as of right now, I would put it as lean Janet Mills there. Pennsylvania is, you know, going to be really busy in 2022 in terms of campaigning and all that stuff. They've got a very contentious Senate race going on right now. Connor Lamb just announced he's running. We'll make a video actually on that because my video on the PA Senate race only included Kenyatta and Fetterman, didn't include Connor Lamb. So if we take a look at the crop for gubernatorial candidates, definitely the strongest right off the bat, in my opinion, is, of course, Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro, who is, now it's been pending. He's basically running for governor. And I think he's actually a very strong candidate for governor for the Democrats, actually. And prior to this, of course, I have stated that, you know, Pennsylvania is likely to flip. I'm not so sure about that anymore. Of course, it still could flip, as the Senate seat might hold Republican. But Pennsylvania is another state that likes to split ticket a lot. Again, we could take a look at the state of Pennsylvania's results in the 2020 election. Joe Biden winning by 1.2%. But if you take a look at the other statewide races in Pennsylvania, the Auditor General and the Treasurer both flipped to Republican. Josh Shapiro won by 5 points over his opponent. He nearly doubled the performance, the margin of victory that Biden had. So it makes it a little hard to predict something like this. Again, I don't really think the Republicans have any strong, necessarily strong Republican gubernatorial candidates. I certainly think if somebody like Lou Barletta does actually win the nomination, which is possible, he'd probably lose the general. I think he's a little bit too conservative for a state like Pennsylvania. He got crushed in 2018 in his Senate race against John Casey. only garnering around 42% of the vote. So he did pretty awful in 2018. Even despite the blue wave year, it was still a pretty low margin of victory than it should have been. And again, I don't really see right off the bat a whole lot of strong Republican candidates. I think if you see somebody like Donald Trump Jr. run, he'll probably lose in 2022. Brian Fitzpatrick would probably be the strongest gubernatorial nominee, although he might have trouble winning a primary since he's a very centrist Republican. So really, as of right now, I actually might flip things around. I actually think the Democrats, with Josh Shapiro as their nominee, probably have a slight advantage going into 2022. Again, all subject to change. But I'm not really impressed by the current crop of Republicans running for the governorship. I think Josh Shapiro probably could eke out a victory in 2022. Maryland, we're going to put as likely Democratic. Maryland was seen as competitive before, and it still might be slightly competitive because Larry Hogan is the incumbent governor and he's very popular. Originally, Boyd Rutherford, who was the lieutenant governor, was going to run for the governorship, or was mulling a run anyway. He decided not to. Michael Steele, who is the, was a nominee for U.S. Senate in 2006, lost. He was a former lieutenant governor under Bob Ehrlich. He's actually, I think, one of the founders of the Lincoln Project, so that could certainly hurt him in a Republican primary. But I think as of right now, the Democrats have a big advantage going into this race. Larry Hogan is a very popular incumbent, but he can't run. Perhaps Anthony Brown, the guy that Larry Hogan beat back in 2014, might try and run again. And he'd probably win. But again, out of the Republicans running for governor, I don't see any ones that are particularly strong. Although, again, I'm not moving it out of the competitive category because it still could be a competitive race. So as of right now, I'm going to put that as a likely Democratic. Georgia is going to be one of the closest races, I think, in 2022 in terms of the governorship. Back in 2018, Brian Kemp only won by 1.2%. At this time, going back to 2016, Trump had won this state by around 5 points, or a little bit under 5. I think it was 5.2 points. So Brian Kemp massively underperformed. And this should have been a sign for Republicans in 2022 to take the state of Georgia a bit more seriously. All it could have taken was one more rally, one more campaign stop to possibly have kept the state in Republican hands, because it only flipped by around 11,000 votes, 11,800 votes. So again, a little bit more energy, a little bit more money possibly could have kept the state of Georgia red in 2020. But this is an off-year election. Turnout's going to matter. But the state of Georgia, because of Atlanta and the Atlanta metro, has gotten a whole lot bluer. And is now, I would say, a purple/Democratic advantage state. And I know that's a little dramatic, perhaps, since it just flipped. But we're talking about, a state that flipped for the first time since 1992 to the Democrats. And Joe Biden isn't even a very right-wing Democrat. He's a standard Obama Democrat. And these are the types of Democrats that Georgia has rejected in the past. You're also talking about 2 Senate races that were lost. The GOP lost in favor of the Democrats in the special elections. So I think right off the bat, that's a giant blow to Georgia Republicans. Republicans still hold all of the statewide offices, but I think Brian Kemp is uniquely vulnerable. He's vulnerable just from another Democrat, and he's vulnerable in a primary against other Republicans because he hasn't really been what they were looking for. Interestingly enough, though, on the governor's level, Georgia seems to be a bit more Republican. Again, we're talking about one polling source, though, but all the polls have Republicans winning except against a hypothetical with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Of course, she would lose probably monumentally in the state of Georgia because candidates like her and like, AOC types, they tend to alienate independents to an unfathomable degree, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene in a state like Georgia, she'd probably get maybe 20% of the independent vote or something like that. So she'd really only be garnering Republican votes there. I actually think this is going to be a Democratic advantage. I think it's going to be a Democratic flip for a number of reasons. Number one, Kemp is not popular amongst his own party. Number two, Kemp is not popular, period. Even if his approval rating has recovered, it's not enough, I think, to save him. Democrats certainly have the energy and the turnout factor in Georgia from 2020 and 2021. And I think that's going to carry over in 2022 if you have a nominee like Stacey Abrams. If you have another Democrat, perhaps we'll come back and we'll change this prediction. But I think as of right now, Georgia flips to the Democrats. The state of Florida, I think Florida with DeSantis is probably going to be likely. Perhaps it could be moved down to a lean margin, all things depending. But, you know, DeSantis still remains relatively popular in the state of Florida. Charlie Crist, if we look at the Democratic primary, Charlie Crist is actually falling out of favor with the electorate. And, of course, this is only one poll. But assuming this trend continues, Nikki Fried looks like she might be the Democratic nominee. And she's certainly the weakest of the Democratic nominees. I was actually told that the one poll that has the Democrat up, the St. Pete's poll, is actually a pretty unreliable poll. But I'm not too sure about that, so we'll leave that up to interpretation. This poll had DeSantis up by 3 against Nikki Fried. I think Florida, like Ohio and such, is a red state. Again, you're talking about a state that when Georgia voted blue, it voted red. Florida is certainly trending red, and I think that's a lot to do with the out-of-state migration of Republican and conservative voters from places like Illinois, New York, New England, etc., moving down to Florida and voting red, and keeping this state Republican, which demographically otherwise probably should be a Democratic state, really. But it's a Republican state, and I think it's likely to stay that way with DeSantis being relatively popular. Whether it's safe or lean or whatever the margin, I think DeSantis, barring some major dip in approval or some major scandal, is probably going to have no problem winning re-election in 2022. So anyway, that's all for today's video. Thank you all for watching. We have Republicans winning the, having 27 of the gubernatorial seats over the Democrats, 21, very likely to be 27-23, maybe 26-22. But as of right now, that's the way 2020 looks from my point of view. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.